She said it quietly. No screaming, no slamming doors. Just 7 words, spoken in the entrance hall of a house I helped build with my own hands, in a voice so calm it almost sounded polite. Maybe you'd be happier living somewhere else. I was 78 years old. I had just recovered from an illness that had kept me in bed for 3 months. I was standing in my son's home, a home that existed, in every practical sense, because of choices I had made over 50 years. And my daughter-in-law looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that no longer fits the room. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached for the overnight bag I kept packed near the wardrobe, a habit from my years as a teacher when early morning excursions required readiness, and I said something I didn't fully understand myself at the time. I said, "I hope one day this house teaches all of us what gratitude really means." And then I walked out into the Dunedin rain. What happened next was not what anyone expected, least of all me. My name is Edward Sinclair. I taught secondary school history for 39 years, mostly right here in Dunedin, Otago. And before we go any further, I want you to understand something. This is not a story about revenge. I know that's what it sounds like. I know the moment I described, an old man pushed out of his own family's home, bag in hand, walking into the cold, feels like the opening of something bitter, something where the wronged party eventually rises up and delivers punishment in a courtroom, or reads a will to a stunned and humiliating silence. People expect that story. I nearly became that story. But what actually happened changed me far more deeply than revenge ever could have. And I think, if you stay with me through all of it, it might change the way you see your own family too. So let me take you back to the beginning. Not the night I walked out. Before that. Because that single evening only makes sense when you understand the years that quietly built toward it. I grew up in a modest home in Caversham, the southern end of Dunedin, in the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and nobody locked their doors before 10 at night. My father was a joiner. My mother worked part-time in a linen shop on George Street. We were not poor, but we were careful with money in the way that people are careful when they understand that comfort is earned and not guaranteed. I was the first person in my family to attend university. I studied history at Otago, right here in this city, which felt enormous to a young man from Caversham. And I fell completely in love with the past. Not the kings and battles that most people associate with history, but the ordinary lives underneath all of that. The farmers, the merchants, the school teachers, the people who built things slowly and left them behind, without any ceremony. I met Eleanor in my second year. She was studying literature and had opinions about nearly everything, delivered in a voice that was slightly too loud for libraries, and absolutely perfect for conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning. We argued about books, about education policy, about whether the Pohutukawa tree near the botanical garden was more beautiful in flower or out of it. She said in flower, obviously. I said out of it, because the bare branches showed you exactly what the tree was made of. We married when I was 26. We bought the house on Highgate the following year, a heritage villa that cost more than we could comfortably afford and required more maintenance than either of us had anticipated, and which we loved absolutely from the first morning we woke up there together. That house was not just a building to us. It was the record of our life. Every room held something. The front hallway with its original Corey floorboards that creaked on the left side only. The kitchen where Eleanor learned to make proper bread, because she refused, on principle, to buy it pre-sliced. The study where I marked 39 years of student essays and kept every lesson plan I ever wrote in folders, arranged by decade along the bottom shelf. The garden that had gone through 3 complete redesigns over the years and still never looked quite the way either of us imagined it, which somehow made us love it more. Michael was born when I was 29. We raised him in that house, and he grew up understanding, I thought, what it meant to build something slowly and take care of it. He was a bright boy, responsible. He went into finance, which I confess I never fully understood, but he was good at it. By the time he was in his early 40s, he was running his own consultancy, doing well, living in a large home in Normanby that he and Rebecca had renovated extensively. Rebecca, I want to be careful here, because this story is not about condemning her. What she did that evening in the entrance hall was careless, and it cut me deeply, but I've had a great deal of time since then to think about the years that preceded it, and I understand now that the situation between us was never entirely her fault. It was something that had grown slowly, like a weed between paving stones, out of neglect and assumption, and the specific kind of silence that families are very good at maintaining, because it's more comfortable than the conversation it's replacing. Rebecca was 46 when all of this happened. She worked in real estate marketing and was very good at it, sharp, organized, always thinking several moves ahead. She had married Michael when they were both in their 30s, and for the first several years, I think we genuinely liked each other. We had long dinners together. We talked about Dunedin, about the changes coming to the city, about wine, about the garden on Highgate, about Eleanor's old recipes that I was attempting to reproduce with mixed results. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. I couldn't point to the exact moment. It was gradual. The dinners became shorter. The conversations became more practical. When I visited their home, I had the sense of being managed rather than welcomed. Small things. The way a guest room is prepared differently than a spare room. The way someone asks, "How long are you planning to stay?" when they mean something other than what the words say. Eleanor died 4 years before all of this. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, and gone within 14 months of the diagnosis. I tell you this not for sympathy. I'm past needing sympathy for it. Or at least I've made my peace with the grief in the particular way that older people do, which is by accepting that love doesn't stop when a person does. But because Eleanor's death changed the geometry of the family in ways none of us fully recognized at the time. Before she died, she was the connective tissue. She was the one who called people, who organized the dinners, who remembered what everyone had said the last time and asked after it the next time. She was the one who noticed when something was wrong between people, before the people themselves noticed it. When she was gone, all of that stopped. Not immediately, but gradually. The way a garden stops looking cared for when the gardener is no longer there. I threw myself into my own life. I had been retired from teaching for 6 years by the time Eleanor passed, and I had arranged that retirement well. A reading group at the library, volunteer work with the Dunedin Heritage Trust, long walks through the Botanic Garden, regular correspondence with former colleagues and students. I was not lonely in the social sense, but there was a particular kind of company missing, the kind that only comes from someone who knows you well enough to disagree with you meaningfully. The illness came the following winter. Nothing dramatic, a chest infection that settled deeper than it should have, a hospital stay of 10 days, followed by weeks of recovery at home that were slow and occasionally frightening in the way that illness is frightening when you are living alone, and realize that your body is less reliable than it once was. Michael and Rebecca suggested, not unkindly at that point, that I come and stay with them while my home underwent some necessary renovation work. The heating system in the Highgate Villa was finally being replaced entirely, along with some work on the roof that had been deferred for too long. I agreed. I packed carefully, books, papers, some of Eleanor's photographs, my journal, my good winter coat, and moved into the upstairs guest suite of their home in Normanby. The first 2 weeks were fine. Michael was busy with work, which I understood and expected. Rebecca kept a very ordered household, and I tried to be unobtrusive. I made my own breakfast. I went for walks in the mornings along the route toward Maury Hill and up toward the reserve. I read in the evenings and went to bed at a reasonable hour. But I noticed things. I'm a historian by training, which means I have spent my entire professional life paying attention to evidence, to patterns in behavior, to the gap between what people say and what the accumulated record actually shows. And the record of those weeks, read carefully, showed something I had been avoiding thinking about for quite some time. I noticed how Rebecca spoke about the house on Highgate. Not directly to me, she was too careful for that, but in passing, on the telephone with someone, or in fragments of conversation with Michael that ceased when I entered a room. She spoke about it the way someone speaks about a property they are already planning what to do with, square footage and location, and the heritage designation, and whether the garden would need significant work, not as a home, as an asset, as a thing waiting to be transferred rather than a place where someone still lived. I noticed how Michael responded to her, which was mostly by not responding. He had a way of absorbing her comments without agreeing or disagreeing, a kind of marital diplomacy that I recognized as the long-practiced behavior of a man who had learned to keep the peace by declining to participate in the difficult parts of it. I noticed how they both spoke about my future, not with cruelty. I want to be clear about that. There was no cruelty intended, but there is a particular kind of thoughtlessness that emerges when people begin to see someone primarily through the lens of what their presence represents for your own plans. It turns an elderly man into a logistical consideration rather than a person. And I could feel that happening, slowly, the way you feel the temperature drop before a southerly comes in off the harbor. The argument that precipitated everything happened on a Tuesday evening in late June. The rain had been coming down all afternoon, the particular cold Otago rain that comes in sideways and turns the streets pewter-colored and makes the streetlights look blurred and far away. We had eaten dinner somewhat awkwardly. The heating in their home was excellent. Everything was comfortable in the physical sense, but there was a tension that had been building for days. The subject was household expenses. Rebecca raised it reasonably at first. There were costs associated with having me there, additional grocery runs, adjustments to their routine, the guest suite which they had apparently planned to use for another purpose starting in August. I listened carefully. I offered, as I had before, to contribute financially to whatever was reasonable. This was not a new conversation. I had savings. I had my teacher's superannuation. I was not a financial burden on anyone. But something about the evening made the conversation go differently than it had before. I said something about the timeline for the Highgate renovations running long. I said the house would be ready when it was ready, and I was not in a position to hurry a heritage roof replacement to suit someone else's schedule. I didn't say it unkindly. I said it clearly. For a man who had spent 39 years teaching secondary school students who would rather be anywhere else, clarity was not something I confused with unkindness. But it landed badly. I could see it in Rebecca's expression, something shifting behind her eyes, some decision being made, and then she said it. Standing in the entrance hall, with the rain audible on the windows and the Kauri floorboards of their own home, catching the light from the overhead fitting, she looked at me with something that was almost composed and said, "Maybe you'd be happier living somewhere else, somewhere people can look after you." I looked at Michael. He was standing 3 feet away, holding a glass of water, and he said absolutely nothing, not one word. In 39 years of teaching history, I learned that the most consequential moments in human affairs are not usually the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, the decisions that aren't made, the words that aren't spoken, the moments when someone who should have acted simply didn't. History is full of those moments. I had taught about them for decades. I simply hadn't expected to live inside one. I went upstairs. I picked up the bag. I came back down. Michael was still standing in the entrance hall. Rebecca had moved to the kitchen. I didn't call out to her. I didn't raise my voice. I wasn't interested in a scene. I said to Michael, quietly, looking at him directly in the way that a father looks at his son when he wants to make absolutely sure the words land properly, "I hope one day this house teaches all of us what gratitude really means." And I walked out. I had no dramatic destination in mind. I walked along the footpath in the rain with my bag over my shoulder, past the lit windows of neighbors I didn't know well enough to knock on, past the roundabout at the end of the street, thinking with the particular clarity that cold air sometimes produces. I thought about Eleanor. Not sadly. She was past sadness, in my mind, and had become more like a compass point than a grief. I thought about what she would say. She would say that standing in the rain, accomplishing nothing, was the most male possible response to an emotional crisis. And then she would hand me a cup of tea, and then she would tell me exactly what I needed to do. I thought about the house on Highgate, about the morning we first walked through it together, its walls smelling of old timber and the previous family's decisions. Eleanor deciding in the first 5 minutes that the front bedroom would be her study, and the back bedroom would catch better morning light. About the way the Cowrie floorboards in the hallway creaked on the left side only, and how after 50 years, that creak was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. And I thought about something I had been avoiding thinking about for quite some time. Not what had been done to me, but what I had quietly, unintentionally, and over many years, allowed to happen. I thought about a particular telephone call I had made to Arthur McKenna 3 months earlier. Arthur was my solicitor, 75 years old, sharp as he had ever been, a man I had known for 40 years, and trusted with every important legal matter in my life. I had called him during the early part of my illness, when you think about these things with more urgency than usual, and we had spoken for a long time about my affairs, about the house on Highgate, about Michael's expectations, about the precise legal weight of words I had used in conversations over the years, words like eventually and inheritance and yours one day, and what those words had built in someone else's imagination. What Arthur said to me during that conversation had stayed with me like a stone in a shoe. He hadn't said anything alarming. He had simply asked a question. He had said, "Edward, have you ever stopped to consider whether the security you have given Michael over the years has helped him become who he might have been, or whether it has protected him from having to find out?" I had not answered the question during that call. I had deflected, the way intelligent people deflect difficult questions, by talking around them, by raising a slightly different issue, by moving on. But walking in the June rain through the streets of Normanby, bag over my shoulder, I found I couldn't move on anymore. Arthur's number was still in my phone. He lived not far from me, from where I used to live, before tonight, in a townhouse near the Botanical Garden, and I knew from long habit that he stayed up late and kept his telephone on. I made the call. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him where I was. I told him what had happened. He listened the way he always listened, which is to say completely, without interrupting, without offering opinions before they were requested. When I finished, he said, "Come and stay here tonight. We'll talk in the morning." I was 2 streets away from Arthur's townhouse. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his kitchen with a cup of tea. Eleanor would have been pleased about the tea, listening to the rain ease off against the windows, and thinking about a house on Highgate that I had owned for over 50 years, and what exactly I intended to do about it. Not in anger. That was the thing. Even then, even in that first raw evening, it was not anger I was feeling. It was something quieter and more complicated than anger. It was the feeling of a man who had taught history for 39 years, suddenly recognizing the pattern he himself had been living inside without seeing it clearly, the pattern of how gratitude slowly, invisibly, almost inevitably, becomes expectation. Arthur set his cup down on the table and looked at me in the way that very old friends look at each other when they are about to say something that matters. "There are things we should probably discuss," he said. "About the house, about your will, about what you actually want to happen, as opposed to what everyone has assumed will happen." I looked at the window. The rain had almost stopped. Outside, the streets of Dunedin were washed and quiet and cold, the kind of cold that in Otago means the morning will be clear and bright. The harbor lit up like it means something. "Yes," I said, "there are." What Arthur showed me the next morning, spread across his kitchen table in careful legal order, was something I had been looking at for years without actually seeing, and what I decided to do with it was nothing like what Michael and Rebecca were quietly expecting, nothing like it at all. Arthur McKenna's kitchen table was not a dramatic place. It was the kind of table that belongs to a man who has lived alone for several years and made a quiet peace with that fact. practical, uncluttered, with a single placemat that was always in the same position and a small ceramic pot that held 3 pens and a pencil. The kind of table where serious things got decided without any ceremony. He laid the documents out slowly, with the deliberate care of a man who understood that the way you present information shapes the way it is received. 40 years of legal practice had given Arthur a particular gift for silence, for knowing when to let a document sit in front of someone and breathe before saying anything about it. I looked at the papers. Property title, registered in my name and Eleanor's, transferred to my sole name following her passing 4 years earlier. My existing will, drafted 12 years ago and reviewed twice since then. A series of letters I'd written to Michael over the years, some attached to financial transfers, some simply personal, in which I had used language that Arthur had flagged in yellow highlighter with the careful, non-judgmental precision of a man who wanted me to see something without telling me how to feel about it. Eventually, all of this will be yours. That was from a letter I wrote Michael when he was going through a difficult period in his consultancy and needed reassurance. I remembered writing it at the desk in the study on Highgate, with Eleanor's reading lamp on because it gave a warmer light than the overhead fitting. The house will come to you one day, along with everything else. That one was from a birthday card. I had written it without thinking, the way you write things in birthday cards, with warmth and general goodwill and very little precision. You don't need to worry about the future of the property. It's always been in the family and it will stay that way. That one was from a conversation that Arthur had transcribed from notes Michael had apparently shared with him at some point, which told me something about the degree to which these things had been taken seriously by people I had not imagined were taking them seriously. I sat with those words for a long time. Arthur refilled my tea without asking and sat back down and waited. I didn't mean any of those the way they read now, I said eventually. I know, he said. But what we mean and what we create in another person's understanding are sometimes very different things, particularly when the understanding is one that the other person very much wants to arrive at. That was Arthur. Precise without being unkind. It was why I had trusted him for 40 years. The morning light was coming in through the kitchen window, the Dunedin winter morning that I had predicted from the previous night's rain, clean and cold and very bright. The kind of light that makes the harbor look like hammered silver when you see it from the right angle. I thought about Eleanor again, about how she had always said that morning, light in Dunedin was honest light. It showed you things exactly as they were. I asked Arthur to tell me everything, not just the legal situation, which I understood reasonably well for a non-lawyer, but his honest assessment of what had been quietly constructed around me and what my options actually were. He spoke for nearly an hour. I listened the way I had trained myself to listen in the classroom, fully, without preparing my response while the other person was still talking. What emerged from that conversation was a portrait I recognized and didn't recognize at the same time. The way you sometimes look at a photograph of yourself from 20 years ago and see both the person you were and the person you didn't know you were becoming. I had been, for the better part of Michael's adult life, a safety net so reliable that it had gradually ceased to feel like generosity and had instead become structural. When his consultancy had cash flow difficulties in its early years, I had transferred funds 3 times across 7 years in amounts that were significant but never quite large enough to feel alarming. When he and Rebecca had decided to renovate the Normanby home extensively, I had contributed a sum that I told myself was a gift and told him was simply helping out, because I didn't want to make it feel transactional. When there were conversations about the future, about what would happen to the Highgate property, about my superannuation, about the portfolio of modest investments I had built over my teaching career, I had always steered those conversations toward reassurance. Always toward reassurance. I had done this because I loved my son. I want that to be completely clear. Every transfer, every softened conversation, every carefully worded letter had come from genuine love and a genuine desire for Michael to feel secure. But Arthur's question from the previous night had not left me. Have you ever stopped to consider whether the security you have given Michael over the years has helped him become who he might have been, or whether it has protected him from having to find out? I'm a history teacher, or I was for 39 years, and one of the things you learn when you spend that long studying human behavior across centuries is that the consequences of actions are almost never contained to the moment in which they happen. Everything reverberates, everything accumulates. A decision made in warmth can produce years later an outcome that would have horrified the person who made it. I had not made Michael the man who said nothing in that entrance hall. His character was his own, built from his own choices and experiences and the particular ways that life had shaped him. But I had, perhaps, made it easier for him to remain that man, rather than grow into a different one. I had removed enough friction from his life that some of the growth that friction produces had simply not had occasion to occur. That was a hard thing to sit with over a kitchen table on a cold Dunedin morning. It is a hard thing to write about now, but it was true, and I had spent 39 years teaching students that the most important thing you can do with a truth, once you have found it, is not to look away. Arthur had a contact, a woman named Margaret Holt, 67 years old, who had been a school principal in Dunedin for 22 years, before retiring and subsequently becoming involved in the management of a small heritage residence near Ross Creek Reserve. The residence had been established some years earlier by a group of retired educators who had wanted a place where people like themselves, people with professional lives behind them and significant experience and knowledge still to offer, could live communally for extended periods while remaining engaged with the wider community. It was not a care facility in any conventional sense. It was closer to what I might have described in my history teacher manner as a collegiate household for people in the later chapters of their lives. Margaret had a spare room. Arthur had telephoned her that morning before I was awake. She had said, without hesitation, that I was welcome for as long as I needed. I want to tell you how I felt when Arthur told me this, because the feeling surprised me. I had expected to feel grateful, which I did, and perhaps slightly humiliated, which I didn't. What I actually felt was something closer to curiosity. I was 78 years old, recently recovered from a chest infection, carrying an overnight bag, sitting in my solicitor's kitchen at 7:45 in the morning, with the cold Otago light coming through the window, and I felt curious, which told me something important. The residence near Ross Creek Reserve was a large villa on a quiet road, lined with mature oaks that had been dropping their leaves in the June cold, and leaving the footpath layered in copper and yellow. The building itself was a handsome double-story wooden structure, painted in deep green with cream trim, with a wide veranda along the front, and a garden that was clearly being maintained with some care, but without the slightly performative perfection of gardens that are trying to impress someone. Margaret Holt met me at the door. She was a compact, direct woman with gray hair, cut practically short and the kind of steady gaze that you see in people who have spent many years managing other people's emergencies and learned not to be destabilized by them. She shook my hand, took my bag without making a fuss about it, and showed me through the house with the efficient warmth of someone who had done this before, and understood that what a new arrival needed first was to understand the geography of the place before they could begin to feel at home in it. The room was on the ground floor, at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. It was modest: a single bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk positioned near the window, a bookshelf that was empty and waiting. There was a small framed print on the wall of Otago Harbor at dusk, the kind of image that is neither remarkable nor offensive, simply present. The window looked out toward the reserve, and even in the bare winter season you could see the top fringe of native bush above the garden fence, dark green against the pale sky. I put my bag down. I stood at the window for a moment. And then I did something I had not done in quite some time. I simply breathed. If you're the kind of person who has been following this story and finding yourself thinking about your own family, about the conversations you've been putting off, the things that have been building quietly behind the ordinary surface of your daily life, I'd ask you to stay with us. This story is going to go places that I think might matter to you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read more of them than you'd probably expect. The other residents of the house were, in their various ways, extraordinary people who had been living ordinary lives for so long that they had nearly forgotten the extraordinary parts. There was Graham Alderton, 71 years old, a retired civil engineer who had spent most of his career working on water infrastructure projects across the South Island, and now spent his mornings doing meticulous pencil drawings of the native birds that visited the garden. He had the habit of narrating everything he was drawing in a low murmur as he worked, not for anyone's benefit, but his own, in the manner of a man who had learned that giving language to observed things was a way of holding on to them. There was Vivian Chu, 68, who had been a public librarian for 30 years in Invercargill, before moving to Dunedin after her husband's retirement, and then his subsequent passing. She ran a small, informal evening reading circle in the sitting room of the house every Thursday, selecting books with what she described as nutritional value, by which she meant books that left you with more than you had started with, regardless of whether they were comfortable to read. There was Patrick Doyle, 74, Irish-born, who had come to New Zealand in his late 30s as a secondary school music teacher and never gone back. He played the piano in the common room on weekend afternoons with the focused pleasure of a man who had made music his whole life and saw no reason to stop making it simply because he was no longer being paid to do so. And there were others, a retired nurse, a former local government officer, a woman who had spent 30 years as a cartographer and still kept large survey maps pinned to the walls of her room, the way other people keep family photographs. These people changed everything. I say that without drama or exaggeration. They changed everything. I had been living alone on Highgate for 4 years since Eleanor's death, and in that time I had told myself, convincingly, most days, that I was managing perfectly well. I had my routines. I had my reading and my garden, and my correspondence, and my occasional volunteer commitments with the Heritage Trust. I was not unhappy, precisely, but I had not understood, until I sat down to dinner on that first evening at the Ross Creek house, with Graham and Vivian and Patrick and the others, how much I had been living at reduced volume. The dinner table was loud in the best possible way, not chaotic. These were not chaotic people, but alive. Graham was making a case for why the Tu'a was architecturally superior to the Kareru as a subject for pencil drawing. Vivian was disputing this on aesthetic grounds with the focused intensity she brought to all literary and artistic arguments. Patrick was eating quietly and occasionally inserting one perfectly placed observation that reframed the entire conversation. The retired nurse, whose name was Sandra, was telling a story about a patient she had treated 30 years ago, who had subsequently become a well-known Dunedin sculptor, and the story had so many unexpected turns in it that the whole table had gone quiet to listen. I sat at the end of the table and felt something unlock in my chest that I had not known was locked. I went to bed that night and wrote in my journal for the first time in nearly 2 months. I had stopped writing regularly after the illness, which I understood in retrospect was a sign that something in me had been going quiet, in a way I hadn't wanted to examine. The journal was an old habit. I had kept one continuously since my university years, and Eleanor had always said that my journals were the most honest version of me, which I had taken as both a compliment and a mild criticism simultaneously. What I wrote that night was not about Michael or Rebecca. It was not about the house. It was not about Arthur's documents or the highlighted letters or the legal weight of words like eventually and one day. What I wrote was a question. I wrote, what is it that I actually want to leave behind? Not in legal terms, not in financial terms, in human terms, in the terms that a history teacher who has spent 39 years thinking about legacy and consequence and the long reverberation of human choices would actually use if he were being honest with himself in the way that the morning light in Dunedin demands. I underlined the question and closed the journal and lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the wind in the reserve beyond the garden fence, a sound that was new to me and somehow deeply restful. And I thought about Eleanor. I thought about a conversation we had had very early in our marriage, in the kitchen on Highgate on a Sunday morning, when we were still young enough that the future seemed both distant and infinitely malleable. She had been washing up and I had been drying, and she had said, out of what seemed like nowhere, that she hoped our life would be the kind of life that made other people's lives better simply by existing near it. Not famous, not significant in any official sense, just present in a way that mattered to the people around it. I had said something typically male and deflecting, something about that being a reasonable aspiration, and she had flicked soap suds at me, and we had both laughed, and the conversation had moved on. But I had never forgotten it, and lying in the dark in the Ross Creek house, 52 years later, I found that I had been circling back to it for the past several hours without realizing it. What is it that I actually want to leave behind? I knew what Michael expected me to leave behind. I knew what Rebecca was planning around. I knew what my existing will specified, and what the legal documents on Arthur's kitchen table had been carefully constructed to protect. But what did I want? The answer, when it came, did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way most true things arrive, which is quietly, without ceremony, in the space between one thought and the next. I thought about the study on Highgate, about the bottom shelf with its folders of lesson plans arranged by decade, about the students who had sat in my classroom over 39 years, hundreds of them, perhaps more, some of whom I still heard from occasionally, in the form of letters or messages that arrived on significant anniversaries, or when something in the news reminded them of a class discussion from decades earlier. About the particular feeling of watching someone understand something for the first time, not remember it, not record it, understand it. The moment when information becomes meaning, when facts arrange themselves into a story that illuminates something true about being alive. That was what I had loved about teaching, not the content, precisely, though I loved the content, but that moment of understanding, that moment when someone who had been closed to something found it opening. I thought about Eleanor's phrase, a life that makes other people's lives better, simply by existing near it. And I thought about the house on Highgate, about what it was built from, and what it had held, and what it still could hold. I reached for my journal. I turned to the page where I had written the question, and I wrote below it, in the careful handwriting of a man who had spent 4 decades writing on whiteboards and marking student papers, not a house that passes between hands, a house that passes something on. That night I slept better than I had slept in months, not because my problems were resolved, they were far from resolved, but because I had found the right question. And finding the right question is always the beginning of the only kind of answer worth having. In the morning, I telephoned Arthur. I told him I wanted to begin drafting something new, not a codicil, not a minor amendment, something entirely different from what anyone was expecting. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, in the measured voice of a man who had heard a great many proposals across 40 years of legal practice, "Tell me what you have in mind, Edward." I began to tell him, and as I spoke, I could feel the shape of something forming, not an act of anger, not a punishment, not the settling of a score, but something that felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely and unmistakably like myself. What I proposed to Arthur that morning would take several weeks to formalize, but the idea itself, once named, was simple, and when Michael and Rebecca eventually heard it, 30 days after the night I walked out into the rain with a single bag over my shoulder, it would change every single assumption they had been quietly building their future upon, not cruelly, not dramatically, but permanently, and in ways that none of us had seen coming, including me. The 30 days between the night I walked out and the morning Arthur scheduled the family meeting were the strangest and most clarifying 30 days I had experienced since the months following Eleanor's death. Strange, because I was living a life I had not anticipated, living at 78, clarifying, because that unanticipated life turned out to be exactly what I needed to understand something I had been misreading for years. I want to tell you about those 30 days properly, not as a list of events, but as the experience they actually were, because the texture of those weeks mattered as much as the decisions I was making inside them. And I think if I skip past the texture to get to the outcome, I will have told you only half of a story that only means something whole. The mornings at the Ross Creek house began early. Graham Alderton was always up before 6, which I discovered on my second day when I came into the kitchen at 5:30 and found him already seated at the table with a cup of black tea and a pencil and a small sketchbook, watching the garden through the kitchen window with the focused patience of a man who understood that what you were waiting to see would only appear if you gave it the dignity of your complete attention. We didn't speak much in those early mornings, Graham and I. That was the discovery. That silence between people who have no reason to perform for each other is a completely different quality of silence from the silence in a family that has stopped saying the things that matter. One silence is full. The other is empty in a way that eventually becomes unbearable. I had been living inside the empty kind for long enough that the full kind felt, at first, almost foreign. On the third morning, Graham slid his sketchbook across the table without comment. It was a pencil drawing of a kereru, a native pigeon, sitting on the branch of what I recognized as the old kohai in the far corner of the garden. The drawing was not technically perfect. The proportions were slightly off in a way that any professionally trained artist would have noticed immediately. But it had captured something that technical precision often misses, which was the particular quality of stillness that a large bird has when it is absolutely comfortable where it is. The kereru in Graham's drawing looked as though it had always been on that branch, and would always be on that branch, and had no particular opinion about whether anyone noticed. I looked at the drawing for a long time. Then I said that it was very good. Graham said, "It's honest, which is better than good most of the time." I thought about that observation for the rest of the day. My days at the Ross Creek house settled into a rhythm within the first week, which surprised me because I had expected the disruption of my usual environment to feel disorienting for longer than it did. Instead, the rhythm found itself almost immediately, as though it had been waiting in the background of my previous life, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to emerge. Mornings were for walking. I had been walking regularly for years. The body of a man who has taught standing up for 39 years, and then found retirement to involve more sitting down than expected, learns very quickly that it needs to be moved deliberately. But the walks from the Ross Creek house had a quality that my Highgate walks had not recently had. Partly it was the route. The reserve itself was immediately accessible from the back gate of the garden, and the walking tracks through the native bush were the kind of tracks that demanded attention, rather than allowing the mind to run on automatic while the feet do the work. The ground was uneven in places. The light came through the canopy in ways that changed completely, depending on the weather and the time of morning, and the sounds of the bush, tuah, bellbird, the occasional rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth, were varied enough to keep you present. But partly it was something else. It was the absence of the particular background anxiety that I had apparently been carrying during my Highgate walks for longer than I had admitted to myself. The low-level hum of a man who is aware, without wanting to be aware, that the people closest to him are circling something, that conversations are being had in his vicinity without including him, that his future is being discussed in terms that do not quite match his own understanding of it. That anxiety, removed, left a space that the reserve filled very naturally with birdsong and cold air and the smell of wet earth. I started bringing my journal on the walks. I would stop at a particular point on the track where a wooden bench had been installed at a curve overlooking a small stream, sit for 20 minutes or half an hour, and write. Not always about the situation with Michael and Rebecca, mostly about other things, memories, observations, things that had come up in the previous evening's dinner conversation, thoughts about books I was reading, fragments of historical reflection that had nowhere particular to go but needed to be placed somewhere outside my head. The act of writing by hand, which I had been doing continuously since I was 19 years old, had a quality that I found myself appreciating with renewed intensity during those weeks. There is something about writing by hand that slows thought to the speed at which it can be examined. You cannot write by hand at the pace your mind moves when it is anxious and uncontrolled. The hand insists on a certain deliberateness, and that deliberateness becomes, with practice, a kind of discipline. Eleanor had always understood this about me. She had bought me journals, proper ones, bound in cloth or leather, not the cheap spiral notebooks that fall apart, consistently throughout our marriage, appearing with a new one each time the current one was approaching its final pages, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who understood that maintaining a person's tools for thought was a form of love. I was using the last journal she had given me. I'd been rationing it, I realized, without consciously deciding to do so, writing less, or writing more briefly, as a way of extending its life, as a way of maintaining the connection to the person who had given it to me. On the bench by the stream, in the cold June mornings with my breath visible and the sketchbook open on my knee, I allowed myself to use the pages at whatever rate they needed to be used. Eleanor would have approved of this. She had a particular impatience with sentimentality that presented itself as preservation, which she considered a way of loving things more than people, which she considered a moral confusion. If you found this story, and you're watching because something in it is speaking to something in your own life, a parent, a family member, a silence of your own that you haven't known how to break, I want you to know that the comments below this video are full of people who feel exactly what you're feeling right now. Leave something there. Tell us where you are in the world. Tell us what this brought up for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This community has become something I'm genuinely proud of, and this story has more to give. The Eleanor Sinclair Fellowship House. That was what I had named it by the end of the first week. Named it in my journal first, where names belong when they are still forming, before they are ready to be spoken aloud. Then named it to Arthur in our second extended telephone conversation, where he received it with the thoughtful silence of a man processing something that was both legally complex and personally significant. I want to explain why I chose that name, and why it mattered more to me than perhaps anything else in the entire arrangement. Eleanor had spent her career as a literature teacher, later as a head of department, and in her final working years as a curriculum advisor to several secondary schools across Otago. She had been, by any measure, a significant educator. Her former students wrote to me still. After 4 years of her absence, they still wrote, which told you everything you needed to know about the quality of what she had given them. But Eleanor herself had been almost constitutionally incapable of thinking of her work in terms of legacy or recognition. She thought about it in terms of immediate effect. Was this student more able today than yesterday? Was this book placed in this person's hands at the right moment? Was this conversation the one that opened something that needed to be opened? She would have been deeply uncomfortable with having something named after her, which was precisely why I did it. Because the Fellowship House was not intended to be a monument. It was intended to be exactly what Eleanor had spent her life practicing, the act of passing something on, not as inheritance, but as investment, not as a transfer of assets, but as a continuation of purpose. The plan, as it took shape across those 30 days in conversation with Arthur, and in my own thinking, was this. The Highgate property, the heritage villa that Eleanor and I had bought the year after we married and lived in for over 50 years, would, upon my death, be transferred not to Michael, but to a trust that Arthur and I were in the process of establishing. The trust would operate the house as a residential mentoring and scholarship residence, providing temporary accommodation to retired educators, nurses, engineers, librarians, craftsmen, and other professionals who wish to offer their knowledge and experience to young people entering those same fields through structured community mentoring programs. The house would continue to be my home for as long as I lived. That was non-negotiable, and Arthur made sure the legal structure reflected it without any ambiguity. I was not giving anything away in the present, I was determining its future use with the specificity that its past deserved. Michael would still inherit, and inherit substantially. The financial portfolio, the superannuation assets, the various investments accumulated over a careful lifetime. These were significant and would represent a genuine and meaningful inheritance. What he would not inherit was the property. Not because I wished to punish him, but because a house built through 50 years of shared sacrifice, of mortgage payments and roof repairs and garden redesigns, and the particular daily devotion of two people who loved each other and loved the place they lived together. That house deserved a future that matched its past. I'm going to be honest with you about something. In those early days, when the idea was still forming and before Arthur had translated it into legal language, there were moments when I tested myself, when I asked whether the decision was emerging from wisdom or from wound, whether I was constructing something meaningful or simply reconfiguring a punishment into more acceptable language. I tested it the way I had always tested my own thinking, which was to apply it to a hypothetical version of events. If Michael had defended me in that entrance hall, if he had stepped forward in that moment of silence and said clearly and simply that this was not how his father was going to be spoken to, would I still be making this decision? I sat with that question on the bench by the stream on the 6th morning, with the cold air around me and the journal open and the pencil not moving, and the honest answer was yes, not entirely in the same form, and perhaps not with the same urgency, but yes, because the question of what the house on Highgate was for and what it should become was a question I had been approaching for years without allowing myself to arrive at it. The crisis had not created the question. It had simply removed the comfortable buffer of deferred consideration that had allowed me to keep not answering it. That distinction mattered enormously to me, not because it excused anything. No silence is excused by the eventual emergence of something useful from its consequences, but because it meant that what I was building was not built out of anger. Anger produces structures that collapse when the anger cools. What I wanted to build needed to outlast me. Graham Alderton said something to me at dinner during the second week that I've thought about many times since. We were talking about his engineering career. I had asked him about it, genuinely curious about the particular discipline of infrastructure work, the long-range thinking it required. And he said that the principle he had returned to most consistently throughout his career was what he called the design life. Every structure you build, he explained, has an intended design life. A bridge might be designed for 100 years, a water treatment facility for 50. The design life is not a prediction of when the thing will fail. It is an aspiration about what the thing should be able to do, and for how long. And the quality of the decisions you make in the design phase determines, more than anything else that comes after, whether the design life is actually achieved. The interesting thing, Graham said, passing the bread without looking up, is that most things built without a clear design life in mind don't last very long, not because the materials are wrong, but because the intention is vague. Vague intention produces vague structure, and vague structure gives way at the first serious pressure. I looked at him across the table. He was buttering his bread with complete concentration. "You're talking about more than bridges," I said. He looked up. "I usually am," he said. Vivian Chu's Thursday evening reading circle became, during those weeks, one of the anchoring points of my week. She had selected, for that particular month, a collection of essays by a New Zealand writer whose work I knew slightly, but had not read carefully, and the discussions that followed each week's reading were the kind of discussions I had not had since my years in the staff room at school, the kind where people disagree with genuine engagement, rather than social management, where someone changes their position mid-conversation because something has been said that genuinely shifts their understanding rather than simply defeats their argument. Patrick Doyle played the piano on Saturday and Sunday afternoons with a kind of serene consistency that I found deeply restoring without being able to explain exactly why. He played mostly from memory, Schubert, older jazz standards, occasionally something Irish that he would hum along to in a low voice that suggested it was connected to something specific and personal that he had no particular desire to explain. On the second Saturday, he began playing something I didn't recognize, and I sat in the armchair near the window and listened to it for the better part of 20 minutes before realizing that I was not thinking about anything. Not about the house, not about Arthur's documents, not about Michael's silence in the entrance hall, or Rebecca's words, or the 30 days counting down toward the family meeting. Not about anything, just the music, and the cold light through the window, and the sound of the wind in the reserve. I cannot tell you how valuable that was. I can only tell you that I hadn't experienced it in a very long time, and that its presence made me realize how long I had been living in the continuous low noise of unresolved things. Arthur and I spoke every few days throughout those 30 days as the legal structure took shape. He was meticulous, which I had always appreciated, but during those conversations he was also something more than meticulous. He was careful in a way that went beyond the legal, that showed the consideration of a man who understood that what we were constructing was not just a document, but a statement about a life, about a marriage, about what it meant to build something and then determine, deliberately, what it was for. There was one afternoon, the third week, a Wednesday, the harbor visible in the distance from the upper window of the Ross Creek house, where I had taken a chair and my journal after lunch, when Arthur read me a draft passage from the trust document, the passage that described the fellowship house's purpose. He had drafted it in legal language, which was necessary, but he had also managed, in the way that very good lawyers occasionally manage, to make the legal language carry some of the emotional weight of what it was describing. He read, "The Eleanor Sinclair Fellowship House shall operate as a residential community and mentoring center where retired professionals of demonstrated experience and vocation may reside temporarily, while contributing knowledge, practical skill, and professional guidance to emerging practitioners in their respective fields, with the purpose of ensuring that expertise accumulated across working lives is transmitted to those beginning equivalent journeys, rather than concluding with the individuals who hold it." He stopped reading. There was a pause on the line. I said, "That's right. That's exactly right." Arthur said, "I thought it was." I had been in contact with Margaret Holt throughout those weeks as well, not about the legal arrangements, which were Arthur's domain, but about the practical dimensions of how such a residence would actually function. Margaret had, through her years of managing the Ross Creek house, developed a practical knowledge of what made a residential community of this kind work and what made it fail. She was generous with that knowledge and direct in a way that reminded me of Eleanor. She didn't soften things that didn't need softening, and she didn't make simple things complicated. She told me that the most important thing in a community of retired professionals was not the programming or the structure or the amenities. It was the culture of the place. Whether the people in it felt that what they knew and had experienced was valuable rather than historical. Whether they were engaged as contributors rather than managed as residents. The moment someone in a place like this starts feeling that their presence is a kindness extended to them rather than a contribution being made by them, she said, you've lost them. Not physically, psychologically. And a person who is psychologically lost is not going to help anyone else find their way. I wrote that down in my journal, word for word. It seemed to me one of the wisest things I'd heard in years. I also, during those 30 days, did something that I had not done for a long time. I revisited the lesson plans. The folders on the bottom shelf of the Highgate study, the ones I had kept across all 39 years of my teaching career, one folder per school year, each one containing the annotated plans I had written for every term. I had not been able to access them, of course, while the house was being renovated, but I had many of the later ones photographed, years earlier, for archival purposes, and Arthur had those files on a drive he was able to share with me. I went through them methodically over 3 evenings, starting with the earliest ones and working forward. The early lesson plans were, I confess, a little painful to read. They were the lesson plans of a young man who knew his material, but was still learning how to understand his audience, how to pace a room, how to sense when a class had reached the limit of what they could absorb in a single session and needed to be let breathe before continuing. But the later ones were different. The later ones, particularly those from my last decade of teaching, had a quality I could read now with somewhat more detachment than I could have managed while I was writing them. They had been built from an understanding of what students actually needed, rather than what the curriculum specified they should receive. They were plans that had internalized the difference between information and meaning, between delivering content and creating understanding. And looking at them, spread across the writing desk in my room at the Ross Creek House, I thought about all the students who had sat in my classroom over 39 years, and about the fact that the knowledge those lesson plans represented, not just the historical content, but the pedagogical understanding, the accumulated insight about how to take what you know and give it to someone in a way that genuinely serves them. That knowledge was sitting in folders on a shelf in a house that was about to be renovated and had not been used to teach anyone anything for 12 years. What a waste. Not because I needed to return to teaching. I was 78 and recently recovered from a chest infection, and I had no particular desire to stand in front of a classroom again, but because the knowledge itself was still alive, because there were people beginning careers in teaching, in nursing, in engineering, in all the quiet, essential vocations that sustain a community without attracting much attention, who could use what people like me and Graham and Vivian and Patrick had accumulated, not as a curriculum, but as a conversation, as a sustained engagement between people who had lived something and people who were beginning to live it. That was the fellowship house. That was what it was for. I closed the folder on the last evening of the third week and sat for a long time at the writing desk with the reserve dark beyond the window and the sounds of the house settling around me. Patrick's piano from the common room, a low conversation between Sandra and the cartographer woman whose name was Diane, the particular creak of the old villa adjusting to the dropping temperature. And I felt, clearly and without ambiguity, that what I was doing was right, not strategically right, not legally right, not right in the sense of winning some argument with the people who had hurt me, right in the way that Eleanor had always talked about rightness, which was whether a thing, done without qualification, would make the world around it slightly better by existing. I had 30 days counted from the night I left. Arthur had scheduled the family meeting for the morning after the 30th day. Michael and Rebecca had been told only that there were matters relating to Edward's affairs that required their attendance at Arthur's office, nothing more. Arthur had been careful about that. On the 29th evening, Margaret knocked on my door at about 9 o'clock. She had a cup of tea. This was a pattern in that house, tea appearing at thresholds, and she asked, simply, how I was doing. I told her, not all of it, but enough. I told her about the decision I had made, and about the 30 days, and about the meeting scheduled for the following morning. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she said something that I want to record here exactly. She said, "The hardest thing about doing something generous after someone has hurt you is that people will always look for the punishment inside the generosity. They will turn it over looking for the knife. Make sure when they look, they find exactly what you intend them to find." I thought about that for a long time after she left. Make sure when they look, they find exactly what you intend them to find. On the 30th morning, I dressed carefully, not formally. I was not going to the meeting myself, which was Arthur's recommendation and one I agreed with, but carefully, the way you dress when something matters. I walked to the bench by the stream. I wrote in my journal. I watched a tuaa move through the Kohai with the absolute authority of a creature that has never had occasion to doubt its own right to be exactly where it is. Then I went back inside and telephoned Arthur. He confirmed the meeting was arranged for 10 o'clock. Michael and Rebecca had confirmed attendance. They were, Arthur said carefully, expecting a conversation about the arrangements for my return to Highgate. They were, in other words, expecting the story to go back to what it had been, which was the last thing that was going to happen. Arthur said he would call me as soon as the meeting was concluded. I said I understood. He paused in the way he sometimes paused when he had something else to say, and was deciding whether to say it. Then he said, "You've done something good here, Edward. Eleanor would have known exactly what to do with that house." I didn't trust myself to say anything to that, so I simply said goodbye and ended the call. I put the kettle on. I sat at the kitchen table in the Ross Creek house, in the chair that had begun to feel like mine, at the table with its morning light coming through the window, and Graham's latest sketchbook left open at a drawing of the old cowhide tree, and Patrick's piano music audible from somewhere upstairs, and the sounds of the reserve just beyond the garden fence. I sat with my tea and I waited, and downstairs in Arthur McKenna's office on the edge of the Dunedin Botanic Garden, two people who had never expected to be surprised were about to walk through a door that would change everything they had assumed about what they were owed, and more importantly, about who they had been quietly becoming while they were busy assuming it. Arthur McKenna's office was not designed to be intimidating. That was something I had always appreciated about it. Some solicitors' offices are arranged with the specific intention of making you feel small. Heavy furniture, formal portraits, the kind of silence that has been professionally cultivated to remind you that you are in the presence of consequence. Arthur's office was not like that. It had good bookshelves, a window that looked out toward the edge of the Botanic Garden, a desk that was cluttered in the organized way of a man who knew exactly where everything was, and had no interest in performing tidiness for its own sake, and two chairs positioned across from his own that were comfortable without being deliberately relaxing. He told me about it afterward. All of it, in the particular detail that Arthur brought to things that mattered, not dramatizing, not editorializing, but reconstructing with the faithfulness of a man who understood that I deserved to know exactly what had happened in that room. Michael and Rebecca arrived at 5 minutes to 10. They were well dressed, which Arthur noted not as a criticism, but as an observation. The way people dress for a meeting they believe will confirm something they are hoping to hear. Rebecca had a leather folder with her. Michael had his telephone, which he placed face down on the desk when he sat, the gesture of a man managing his own anxiety through small demonstrations of control. Arthur offered them tea. Rebecca declined. Michael accepted and then didn't drink it. Arthur sat down, opened the document folder on his desk, and said, "Thank you both for coming. Before we begin, I want to clarify something. This meeting is not about Edward's return to the Highgate property, as I think you may have assumed. It is about his instructions regarding the future disposition of that property and the legal arrangements he has put in place concerning it." Arthur told me that the silence that followed this statement lasted approximately 4 seconds. He had counted. He was the kind of man who counted things like that. Then Rebecca said, "What kind of arrangements?" And Arthur told them. He was methodical about it. He went through the trust structure first, the legal architecture, the mechanism by which the Highgate property would pass not to Michael, but to the Eleanor Sinclair Fellowship House Trust upon Edward's death. He explained the purpose of the Fellowship House. He explained the provisions made for Edward to continue residing at Highgate for the remainder of his life. He explained, with equal clarity, that Michael would still inherit the financial assets, the investments, the superannuation, the savings, which were substantial and represented a genuine and significant inheritance by any reasonable measure. He explained all of this in the even, precise voice of a man who had delivered difficult news in professional contexts for 4 decades and understood that clarity delivered without cruelty was the most respectful thing you could offer someone in a moment of shock. When he finished, Michael had not moved. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the desk, and Arthur said that his expression was not the expression of a man calculating loss. It was the expression of a man looking at something and beginning, slowly and with some discomfort, to recognize it. Rebecca was different. She sat with her leather folder closed in front of her, and she was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and she said, very quietly, "This is because of what I said." Arthur said, "Edward's decision was his own and was made on its own terms, but I would not be honest with you if I told you that the events of the evening in question had no bearing on the timing." Rebecca said, "That's the same thing." Arthur said, In some respects, yes. Michael said nothing. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he said, not to Arthur, but to the window, to the botanic garden beyond it. He said he hoped the house would teach us something about gratitude. Yes, Arthur said. He meant this, Michael said. He meant this, Arthur confirmed. I was not in that room. I was sitting in Arthur's kitchen. He had given me a key months ago, as old friends do, drinking tea and watching the garden and waiting for the telephone to ring. But when Arthur told me what Michael had said, sitting in that office with his hands flat on the desk, looking at the window, I felt something happen in my chest that I had not expected to feel. Not triumph. Nothing like triumph. Something more complicated and more valuable than triumph. Something that felt like the beginning of a conversation that should have happened years earlier, and was only now finding the conditions in which it could. Arthur called me at 11:47. I know the exact time because I had been looking at the clock on the kitchen wall with the involuntary regularity of someone trying not to look at it and failing. He said the meeting had concluded. He said both Michael and Rebecca had received the information. He said there had been no raised voices, no dramatic scenes, no threats or ultimatums. He said, Rebecca asked, before they left, whether she could speak with you directly. Not through me. Herself. I asked what I should do with that. Arthur said, I think you already know. He was right. I did. I told him to give Rebecca the address of the Ross Creek residence and to tell her she was welcome any time. Not soon. Any time. In her own time. When she was ready. Not for my sake. I want to be honest about that. But because I had spent 30 days thinking about what Margaret Holt had said, about what people find when they look for the knife inside the generosity, and I had decided with complete clarity that what I wanted people to find was exactly what it appeared to be. An open door. The weeks that followed the meeting were quieter than I expected. I had anticipated that the decision, once delivered, would produce immediate reaction, phone calls, letters, some form of urgent communication that would require management. But what actually happened was silence, not the empty silence of the entrance hall in Normanby, a different kind. The silence of people who have received information they need to think about before they can speak about it honestly. Michael sent a letter, a handwritten one, which surprised me. He was not a man who wrote by hand, in the way that most people of his generation had moved away from it. The handwriting was slightly uneven, which told me it had been written in a state of some emotion, though the content itself was measured. He wrote that he understood the decision. He wrote that he did not intend to contest it, legally or otherwise. He wrote that he had been thinking about the evening in the entrance hall, and about every evening before it, and about the silence that he had allowed to stand in the place where something else should have been, and that he was beginning to understand that the silence was not something that had happened to him, but something he had chosen, and that this distinction, small as it might look from the outside, felt very large from where he was standing. He did not ask me to reconsider. He did not ask for anything. He simply said that he was sorry, in the direct and unqualified way that an apology only works if it is offered without the expectation of a particular response. I read the letter 3 times. On the 3rd reading, I wept, which I had not expected. Not from sadness, from the particular relief of seeing someone you love demonstrate that they are more than the worst thing they have done in your presence, I wrote back. Not immediately. I waited a week, because some letters need time to answer honestly, and I wrote to him about the lesson plans in the folders on the bottom shelf of the study, about what I had seen when I revisited them, about the 39 years of understanding they represented, and what I hoped the Fellowship House would do with that kind of accumulated knowledge. I wrote about his mother and about what she had said in the kitchen on Highgate all those years ago, about wanting a life that made other people's lives better simply by existing near it. I wrote that I believed he was capable of that kind of life, and that I had never stopped believing it, even in the entrance hall, even walking out into the rain. I did not say all was forgiven, because forgiveness is not a single event. It is a practice, and I was still in the early stages of it. But I said enough. The moment that changed everything. The moment I have returned to more than any other when I think about those months. The moment I would choose if someone asked me to identify the exact point at which the story turned from what it had been into what it became, did not happen in Arthur's office. It did not happen in my letter to Michael, or in his letter to me. It happened on a wet afternoon in late July, 3.5 weeks after the family meeting, when the rain was coming off the harbor in the particular sideways fashion that Dunedin reserves for days when it wants to remind you that the Southern Ocean is not very far away. I was in the common room at the Ross Creek house, reading, when Margaret knocked and said that there was someone at the front door for me. I went to the entrance hall. Rebecca was standing on the veranda, outside the front door, in the rain. She had no umbrella. She was wearing a good coat, dark, slightly damp across the shoulders, and she was holding something, a single envelope, slightly softened by the rain at the edges, held carefully in both hands in the way you hold something you don't want to damage. She had not rung the bell. She was simply standing there, with the rain falling steadily around her, and when I opened the door, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not in all the years I had known her. It was an expression without any management in it. No professional composure, no social calibration, none of the careful performance of someone who has spent her career presenting things in their best possible light. She looked exhausted and open and very young, in the way that people sometimes look very young in the moments when they have put down something heavy they have been carrying for a long time. She said, "I wrote you a letter. I've written it 6 times, and this is the one that's actually true." She held out the envelope. I looked at her standing in the rain with the wet envelope in both hands, and I thought about 39 years of teaching history, and about everything I had ever tried to explain to students about what makes a human moment significant. It is not the grand gesture. It is not the dramatic setting. It is the quality of honesty in it, the willingness to stand outside in the rain without an umbrella, holding something true, rather than remaining comfortable inside something false. I opened the door wider. I said, "Come in out of the rain, Rebecca. You can read it to me yourself." She came in. Margaret appeared from somewhere. She had a gift for appearing with exactly what was needed at the right moment, and took Rebecca's damp coat and disappeared again. I brought Rebecca to the sitting room, which was warm and quiet, the afternoon light flat and gray through the windows, the sounds of the house around us. She sat. She held the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it and began to read. I will not reproduce the entirety of what she said, because some things belong to the people they are said between. But I will tell you the substance of it, because it matters to understanding what happened to our family. She said that she had started, at some point she could not precisely identify, thinking about the house on Highgate differently from how she had thought about it initially. She said it had been gradual, the way things shift gradually when you don't examine them, and that she had told herself the gradual shift was practical thinking, was financial realism, was simply being responsible about the future. She said she had not noticed, had actively not noticed, when it had crossed the line from practical thinking about the future into treating a living person's home as though it were already an asset awaiting transfer. She said she had not understood, until Arthur read out the founding purpose of the Eleanor Sinclair Fellowship House in that office, what the house on Highgate actually was, not as a legal entity, as a thing built by 2 people across a lifetime of deliberate choices. She said she thought she had seen it clearly, and that she had been looking at something else entirely wearing the same address. She said the words she had spoken in the entrance hall had not been spoken in cruelty. She said she knew I knew that, but she also said that the absence of cruelty did not make them acceptable, because they had come from something she was more ashamed of than cruelty. They had come from thoughtlessness, from the specific kind of thoughtlessness that is produced when you have begun to see a person as an inconvenience to your plans, rather than as the author of everything your plans are built upon. She stopped reading. She looked up. She said, "I saw you as something standing in the way. You built the way. That's what I didn't understand. If you are watching this, if you have stayed with me through all of it, through all 4 parts of this story, I want to say something directly to you. Not as a narrator completing a script, as an old man who has learned something the hard way and wants to make sure it travels beyond the specific circumstances in which he learned it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment below. Tell me if there is someone in your life you've been seeing as a circumstance rather than a person. Tell me if this story brought something up for you. Tell me where you are in the world. These stories only mean something if they land somewhere real. I didn't say anything for a long time after Rebecca finished reading, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was taking the time to respond from the right place, rather than from whatever immediate impulse the moment produced. Then I said, "You are not the first person to confuse a foundation for an obstacle. It happens in every family eventually. The question is not whether it happens. It is what you do once you see it clearly." She nodded. Her eyes were full. I said, "Eleanor would have said something sharper than that and considerably funnier, but I'm doing my best." Rebecca laughed. It was a short, slightly broken sound, the kind of laugh that arrives when something has been released that needed releasing. It was the most genuine thing I had heard from her in years. We talked for a long time that afternoon. Not about the house, not about the legal arrangements, not about the fellowship trust. We talked about Michael and about what it cost him, over many years, to manage the space between the 2 important people in his life, who were not finding the common ground they should have found. We talked about Eleanor and about things Rebecca had not known. Small things, specific things, the kind of details that fill in a person, rather than outlining them, that I offered freely because she asked about them with a sincerity she had not previously brought to those conversations. We talked about what gratitude actually is, not as a sentiment, as a practice, as something you have to do deliberately and repeatedly, the way you maintain a garden or a heritage building, not once and then considered complete, but continuously, because the things worth keeping require the sustained attention of the people who value them. Before she left, Rebecca said she wanted to know if there was anything she could do for the fellowship house. In any practical capacity, I said I would think about it. I thought about it that evening, walking the Ross Creek track in the early dark, the reserve quiet around me and the lights of the city visible through gaps in the bush. I thought about Margaret's words about the culture of a place, about people feeling that their contribution was real, rather than their presence a charity. I thought about the Highgate Garden, which had gone through 3 redesigns over 50 years, and still never looked quite right, and which I loved for exactly that reason, and about how much work it would need before the fellowship house could open properly. I thought about a heritage building that required not just legal establishment, but physical preparation, rooms to be converted, study spaces to be arranged, a library corner that Vivian had already sketched out enthusiastically on the back of a reading circle agenda, a garden that needed significant attention. The following spring, Michael and Rebecca arrived at Highgate on the first Saturday of October with work clothes and practical intentions. Michael had contacted a heritage restoration specialist he knew professionally. Rebecca had, with the particular organizational precision that made her very good at her work, drafted a renovation schedule that was both realistic and ambitious. They did not come to reclaim anything. They came to build something. I was there when they arrived. I had moved back into Highgate when the original renovations were completed. The house was my home, for as long as I lived, and I intended to live in it fully. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table together for the first time in what felt like an entirely different version of our lives. Michael said, "Where do you want us to start?" I said, "The garden. It's always needed more attention than we gave it." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who understood the statement applied to more than the garden. We went outside. The October morning was the particular Dunedin spring that arrives after a long winter with a kind of cheerful insistence. The light clear and cold and very bright, the harbor visible beyond the rooftops in its morning silver. The pohutukawa in the back corner of the garden, a tree Eleanor had planted in the first year we lived there, which had taken decades to properly establish and was now a substantial and beautiful thing, was beginning to show the very first signs of its late-season color. Eleanor had been right about the Pohutukawa in flower, I decided then. Entirely right. I had been wrong about the bare branches, or at least only partly right, which amounted to the same thing. Over the following year, the Highgate property was gradually and carefully prepared for its future life. Michael and Rebecca came most weekends. They became, in the quiet and consistent way of people who have found a purpose that actually fits them, two of the Fellowship House's most dedicated volunteers. Michael's financial expertise proved invaluable in establishing the Trust's operational structure. Rebecca's organizational and marketing skills, applied now to something that had no commercial motive, which I suspect freed her in ways she had not anticipated, brought a clarity of presentation to the Fellowship House's community programs that gave them a reach none of us had expected so quickly. The first residents of the Eleanor Sinclair Fellowship House arrived the following autumn, 2 retired teachers, a former district nurse, a civil engineer in his late 60s, who reminded me somewhat of Graham Alderton. They were welcomed at the door of the Highgate Villa on a clear April morning by Margaret Holt, who had agreed to serve as the house's first director of operations, and by me, standing in my own entrance hall in the heritage home I had bought with Eleanor 52 years earlier, feeling something that I want to try to name correctly because it mattered. Not pride, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having proven something to someone who doubted me. What I felt was continuity, the sense of a life extending forward, past its own natural boundaries. Eleanor's name above the door and inside the door, the accumulated life of a house where something had been built slowly and with love, now being used to build something else slowly and with love, in exactly the way that things built well tend to generate the conditions for things to be built well again. I think about gratitude differently now than I did before any of this happened. I used to think about it as a response, as something you felt when something good had been done for you, a reaction to a preceding event. I understood it sentimentally, the way most people do, as a warm feeling associated with receiving something. What I understand now is that gratitude is a practice, an active, continuous, deliberately renewed practice. It does not sustain itself. It requires attention the way a garden requires attention, not once, not in a grand initial gesture, but daily, quietly, in the ordinary moments that most people do not notice because they are looking at the larger shape of things rather than the specific ground under their feet. The evening I most return to, when I think about all of this, is an evening in late autumn of the following year. The Fellowship House had been operating for 6 months. The first residents had completed their initial term, and several had extended. The garden that Michael and Rebecca had spent a year restoring was in its particular late-season condition, spare, a little bare, but with the structure beneath the bare branches clearly visible, which I had once argued was the most honest version of a garden, and which I still believed, with the additional understanding now that honesty and beauty are not opposites, but different expressions of the same thing. I was sitting under the Pohutukawa. It was an evening in the particular Otago autumn that arrives after daylight saving ends, cold and very clear, the harbor lit from the west in long, gold light. From inside the house I could hear voices, the current residents at dinner, the sound of a conversation with enough life in it to carry through the window glass. Patrick Doyle was not there. The Ross Creek house was his home, and the Fellowship House was a place he visited and contributed to. But Vivian Chu had agreed to run a reading circle there on alternate Thursdays, and her voice was one of the ones I could hear, making a point about something with the focused intensity that she brought to all literary arguments. I sat under the Pohutukawa, and I looked at the harbor, and I thought about Eleanor. I thought about her practical way of loving people, her refusal of sentimentality as a substitute for action, her insistence that a good life was not one that felt meaningful, but one that was constructed to be useful, specifically, concretely, practically useful to the people around it. I thought about what she would say if she could see the house now, She would say something characteristically deflating about the garden needing more work in the south corner. She would find something wrong with the reading circle's book selection and have a long and enjoyable argument with Vivian about it. She would make tea and bring it to whoever needed it most without asking whether they wanted any. And then, I think, when no one was looking, she would stand in the entrance hall of the house we had built together, and she would look at what it had become, and she would allow herself, very briefly and very privately, to be pleased. I have been a historian for the better part of my life. I have spent decades thinking about what it means to leave something behind, what constitutes a legacy worth the name, how the choices of ordinary people ripple outward through time in ways they cannot predict, and often do not live to see. I taught this material to hundreds of students, most of whom I believe absorbed it in the intellectual way you absorb things in school, correctly placed in the mind without yet having anywhere real to sit. But here is what I know now, that I did not know when I was teaching it. The greatest victory available to any of us in this life is not watching someone fall after they have hurt you. It is not the satisfaction of being proven right. It is not the comfort of the moral high ground, which is a cold place to live, and a poor foundation for anything you actually want to build. The greatest victory is witnessing someone find the courage to become kinder than they were the day they caused you pain. Michael and Rebecca are not perfect people. I am not a perfect person. No family is. What families are, at their best, is a group of people who agree, sometimes only after considerable difficulty and considerable pain, to keep trying, to keep showing up, to keep doing the work that caring for each other actually requires, rather than the version of it that is comfortable and convenient and does not demand too much of anyone. We are, at our best, that. And the house on Highgate, Eleanor's house, the Fellowship House, the building that began as a home and became a home for more people than either of us imagined when we walked through its door for the first time 52 years ago, is proof that the things built in love, if they are determined well and cared for honestly, can outlast any single failure and continue doing what they were always meant to do, which is to make the lives around them slightly, specifically, practically better. Eleanor always knew that. She was usually right. The Pohutukawa is in flower now, over my head, as I sit in the garden on this autumn evening, and I confess she was right about that too. If this story has meant something to you, I hope you will do something with that meaning. Not a grand gesture, something small and specific and real. A phone call you have been putting off, a conversation you have been managing around rather than having, a person you have been seeing as a circumstance rather than as someone who built the ground you are standing on. That is all any of this has ever been about. Thank you for staying with me through all 4 parts of this story. If you've made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe if you haven't already. We tell stories here that are worth the time, and there are more of them coming. Leave a comment below and tell me what this story brought up for you. Tell me if there is someone in your life this made you think of. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, because these stories travel further than I ever expected, and I am grateful every single time to know where they land. Take care of each other. The ordinary, daily, unglamorous work of it. That is the whole thing. That is all of it.